Okay, what I'd like to start off with is just for a few minutes, because I realized at the end of the last class I kind of went quickly over a very fundamental issue. Okay, when I said that what the defense does, it draws upon the whole of human history to show how our relationship with goods, our relationship to things, is always symbolic. That is, there is no such thing as human experience without a dimension of meaning to it. I saw some puzzled looks. So I just want to go over that a little bit clearer. What that means is, okay, this is what is fundamental. That is, our relationship when we relate to things. That's actually just not a thing. When we relate to the world, but we're talking here about advertising in particular, and advertising talks about things. When we relate to things, we relate to them on two different levels. In analytically, we can separate them. In practice, you can't separate them out. In practice, that is, there is what goods do. Right? If it's a pen, there is what goods do. That is, this pen, its utility. It writes. And then there is what my use of it means. And there is always a meaning to whatever our interaction with objects is. Now, it may seem difficult for you to figure out, like, what's the meaning of me using this pen? Well, imagine if instead of this pen being, a cheap UMass pen, if in fact it was a really expensive, $500 pen. If that makes a difference, if the fact that it suddenly became, what's a high level? What's a brand for a high level pen? Cross. Well, any one of those. If there's one of those, and you knew what it was, the meaning of my use of this thing changes. Which means the fact that you don't know about it doesn't mean that there is no meaning. It just means that it's not highlighted. But if it makes a difference, what this pen is, then it means that even the use of this pen is symbolic. It means the symbolism actually doesn't mean very much. The symbolism is not status. The symbolism is actually just an ordinary pen. That's the meaning of it. If it was a more expensive pen, it would mean something different. If that difference, right, it's a pen, it does the same thing. I'm sure it does it equally well. But if what makes a difference is that additional meaning, then that is a function of every single interaction that we have. Meaning is always there, even if it doesn't seem it's there, even though we don't think, oh, this is what the meaning is, even though we don't think about that consciously, that aspect of symbolism, that symbolic aspect is always there. And remember, the way to figure that out is, would it make a difference if it was something else? And if the answer to that is yes, then there is always a symbolic dimension to it. It's what the anthropologists call, this is the fancy term they use. Actually, let me just get this off the board for a second. Okay, it's what the anthropologists call the symbolic constitution of utility. Right? Utility, that's what we use. That's the way we use these products. That's their material. And then there is always a symbolic constitution to it. There's always what it means. And that is what that's what the defenders of advertising recognize. They say, look, there's always a symbolic dimension to how we use things. So if advertising doesn't lie, what's wrong with it? Right, it's a very powerful argument. And what I wanted to say was actually, yes, that first part of the argument is absolutely true. But the second part of the argument from anthropology would be that actually, yes, it's true, but that the control of symbolism is always linked up to social power. It is used, again, symbolism doesn't just fall from heaven fully formed. The meaning of anything is in fact given by human beings. And we saw that I try to make the example we used of diamonds, to show that the meaning of diamonds is forever and whatever. That didn't come fully formed from heaven. It didn't even come very far back in history. And every idea that we have, every symbolic dimension of our lives is made by someone. Someone comes up with it, someone creates it, someone has control of it, someone tells that story. And so just saying it's always symbolic, so that, stop complaining about it, is not enough. The next part of it, if it is always symbolic, well, who controls the symbolism for what ends? Who controls the stories for what ends? Because if you can control the stories of a culture, if you can control that symbolic dimension, then you actually have total control. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius was once asked, someone said to him, what would you do if you were ever to run the state? If you were in charge, if you were to rule the state, what would you do? And he gave a very interesting answer. He said he would, quote, rectify the language. What he meant by that was he would control the language. If he was asked today, he would say, give me control of the media. And if I can control the stories that people understand the world through, then you don't need to have police on street corners or the police to maintain power. You can imprison people in their own imaginations. You can imprison people in their own heads. That's the power of language. That's the power of symbolism. That's the power of storytelling. Depending upon who tells a story and what that story is, you can, in fact, control how people think about the world. So whenever you think about symbolism, you can't help but also ask, okay, whose symbolism? For what end? For what effect? Who controls? Those are actually the interesting questions to come out of it. And what I want to do is actually, I want to take that insight that is developed from the defense, and I want to marry that with the very interesting set of questions that the critics ask about how is advertising connected to social power? How is it connected to these broader structures? Let me give you another example of what we mean by symbolism. How there's always a symbolic dimension to how we interact with the world, and that this is actually very cultural specific. Now let's think about food. Okay, food. People say, well, what's symbolic about food? People get hungry, you eat, etc. Well, actually, one of the things we know is that people won't just eat anything. Even when people are starving, when they've been shipwrecked or there's been some kind of air crash, and the only way they can stay alive is by eating their other passengers who may have died. We know that people, in fact, won't do what it will take to keep them alive, because in their minds there is something, in their symbolism, in the stories in their mind, there is something wrong with eating other people, and even if it means that this body is going to die, they won't do it. Look at the ways in which different animals are treated in different cultures. Okay, in this culture, it'd be very difficult to think about feeding, using, for example, horses as food. We think about them as food for something else, but in other cultures, people eat horses. In other cultures, people eat dogs. People eat cats. There's nothing that's a symbolic dimension. In this, we will not eat it because it doesn't. In this context, it means something different. And again, the more domesticated. That's why, the more domesticated something is. That's why we don't eat dogs, because dogs are considered to be part of the family. And just the same way you don't eat other members of your family, you don't eat dogs. Well, in other cultures, dogs are not members of the family. Dogs are treated very differently. Therefore, you have a different relationship to them. It's not just as a fluffy little pet. It's also it might be a pet, but you also have a domestic relationship to them as food. So that's what that means. The symbolic dimension of utility. There's always a symbolic dimension, and what we have to figure out is how is it used, by whom, for what end. If you only say that everything is symbolic, and as long as advertising doesn't lie, it's okay. It actually asks less. It gets at less than half of what's really interesting about that statement. Okay, so I want to clarify that. This is the way to think about it. Is it okay? Whatever use of your product, if you can imagine that product that it being a different type of product with a different meaning, and if it makes a difference, then even though you don't think there is any symbolism to using this pen, there is. If it makes a difference, then that symbolic dimension is always, in fact, a part of it. And what I'm interested in doing is getting from that key insight to the question of how it is used. And we'll ask later on in the semester some very, very specific questions. It's not just abstract questions of power. It's like, what does the way, in terms of how symbolism is controlled, what does that do to things like the environment? How is global warming connected to the control of symbolism? How is our own personal debt, how much money we owe, connected to the stories that are circulating in our head about what objects are supposed to mean? So the effects of this are very, very concrete. Now, how do we? So what I've laid out, what we've done so far is we've laid out a series of arguments. I mean, we've done, I've kind of said, why should we study it? I've given some examples of it. Then we've looked in the last 3 classes at all the different arguments around the institution of advertising. Again, I want to stress again, that does not exhaust the criticism. If we wanted to, or the defense of it, we could look at that from a whole range of different dimensions. For example, it's not a matter of being liberal or conservative. It's not that liberals don't like advertising and conservatives do. There's a lot of conservatives, in fact, who detest advertising because of what is in advertising. They think that advertising focuses too much on sexuality and the body, and that this is somehow immoral. At the same time, there are left-wing liberal critics of advertising who also would actually also come from not from the same perspective, but also say, actually, yes, the stories around sexuality, in fact, are very negative. Now, we haven't even looked at that. That's not something we're examining right now. But there's a whole range of different arguments that can be made once we start looking at the content of it. And we'll do some of that later on. What we're interested in right now is looking at the specifics of the institution. Not of individual messages, but of the institution. Now, what we're going to do today, actually for the next 3 classes, is we're going to go back and we're going to do some history. Because again, if you want to understand the present, you've got to go back and figure out and understand why it was put in place in the past. So studying history is not some abstract thing to do for its own sake. There is reason to do it for that reason. But to understand the present, we also have to go back into the past. So I want to look at the key historical period in American society that led to the rise of advertising. And especially, the rise of advertising is rooted in some fundamental changes taking place in American culture, in the United States, in the period from 1850 to 1920. This is the transition of America from an essentially an agricultural rural society to an urban-centered society. That's the transition we're looking at, and it happens sometime in that period. And what I want to stress also is that this is, I want to stress the necessity of advertising developing within those changes. Advertising doesn't develop because some brilliant individual came up with this idea, and if that individual didn't exist, there wouldn't be advertising. Advertising, the way we have to think about advertising is structurally, that it plays a structural role in the society, in the economy, in the culture. And that, in fact, the reason advertising arises, and in fact the reason it looks like it does at the present time, is because of the way in which the society is organized. It fulfills, in fact, a very, very specific function. And it's not that's to do with broader structural issues, not individual people saying, I think we should advertise. And not being based on any kind of individual creativity. It's actually to do with structures. Now, to understand that, what we're going to look at, this is the layout, the things we're going to look at today. This economic and social history. You'll need the handout. I hope everyone brought it with them. The social and economic roots of the consumer culture. Okay, we're going to look at. Okay, so let's see how I can pick this up. We're going to look at this. We're going to look at the changes from 3 perspectives. Good. Firstly, economic transformation. Secondly, business strategy. And then thirdly, as advertising as solving the social crisis of industrialization. So I'm just laying that out. We're going to look at those 3 major changes that are going on. Let's start with, if we're going to look at the rise of advertising, let's look at the situation before there was advertising, and try and understand America actually in